My story began with a death sentence.
My beginning is before AIDS.
She talked about this new disease. It was going to change the face of medicine in South Africa.
Very few of us had any understanding of the epidemic.
Really, I had absolute, complete faith in the fact that, science would prevail.
When the epidemic first came, I thought it really didn't concern us. It was a problem of white gay males in California, and that was a dreadful mistake because, as you've seen from the 80s, we've become the worst affected country in the entire world.
We had HIV. We didn't have the drugs at that stage.
The drugs haven't arrived.
Who could afford to be on the antiretrovirals? And you were talking about $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
We had this real view that there was new hope. I think we were all a bit patient. We were saying, Mbeki comes to power and we need to allow him a bit of time to bed down. Same was true for Mantu.
What I kept hearing was, you wanted a policy on treatment, you've got it.
Some of the memories I have is of a lot of people dying, a lot of friends dying, personal confrontations that I had which were unpleasant with the former Minister of Health.
It was already known that the infection in children can be prevented, and yet they were still dragging off feet.
There was a bit of conflation of the issues. We then got into a bit of a debate which polarized us as a country.
As we grew, AIDS denialism hardened. As it hardened, we had to fight it harder. As we fought it harder, Thabo Mbeki, being a proud and arrogant man, hardened his position further, and unfortunately we got into a kind of, I think, vicious spiral.
There were very few people who supported us fighting Thabo Mbeki. And within the government itself, if there is a handful I can think of who stood up, it's a lot.
From an international perspective, we were embarrassed.
Bearing in mind that it's always been the case that an effective response will have to be a national response.
What moved and inspired and motivated you in those days was the personal interactions with people.
I think it's right to capture this history.
The beginning for me was in 1983 when I was on sabbatical in England, and the first television programs around this new disease, which nobody understood, were shown. And I was just in the UK for a few months, and then I came to Durban and I started working on labour migration and looking at mine workers. And in 1986, the Chamber of Mines, 86 or 87, the Chamber of Mines did their first survey. They were starting to see workers from Malawi particularly falling ill and dying. They did a survey. They found Malawian workers were infected, and as somebody who was working on migrants and migrant workers' rights, I thought, oh my God, a sexually transmitted disease that is going to affect migrants is going to have huge impact in this society. So in 1987 there was a conference at the Barbican Centre, the first global impact of AIDS conference, and I went and gave a paper on migration.
Was Sheila Marks there?
I think so. I think so.
Okay, fantastic.
I think so. It's a long time ago. That's nearly 25 years ago now. I gave a paper there not really knowing what I was doing, and but it was so clear to me that we were going to face a huge problem. 1990, I worked for the Development Bank of Southern Africa, looking at what potentially AIDS might do, did some projections which were way out, and then, because we were doing that, discovered the liberation health workers were doing similar sorts of things. Johnny Steinberg, Patrick Masobe, Anthony Kinghorn, and no, not Johnny Steinberg, Malcolm Steinberg, and they had produced some work. And I then, at the same time, started publishing a newsletter designed to get people thinking about it, which was called AIDS Analysis Africa. It was a newsletter, a subscription newsletter, and then since then, work has become more and more around HIV. The other milestones would be first book in 1992, 1998 established HERD at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, 2000 published with Clem Sunter, 2002 published AIDS and Globalization with Tony Barnett, and then just 2 years ago published a very short introduction to HIV/AIDS, and masses of other publications in between time. The other major area of interest for me is Swaziland, which is the country I grew up in and where I continue to work very closely with people. That's right, there was an ANC gathering, it was 91 or 92, and then we had a huge meeting in Sandton where I think there must have been 1,000 people in the room trying to get our heads around what HIV was going to mean. And some of the people that you see around today were there. The people who I well remember, who perhaps had a feel for what was going to happen, Reuben Scheer, who sadly died last year, was one of the first doctors who really understood it. Barry Shube, but he's always been a bit more distant because he's more of a scientist. So yes, I was involved in the early establishment. I was also on the advisory council that was set up by the Department of Health, which collapsed during the dark years of Mantu Shabalala Msimang. I would have to say that at that point, very few of us had any understanding of what the epidemic was going to do. We had an idea of the numbers. We were making projections, and to be honest, we haven't been that far off in our projections, which is a real indictment of the failure of prevention activities. But I don't think anyone can understand what happens in a society where you have so many people who are ill and dying and so many children who are orphaned. And I think that when we look at how successful South Africa is, and it is successful, it's despite AIDS, and if we didn't have AIDS, I think this country would be so much better off. But it's a sort of, it's an unknown. You can't measure something that hasn't happened. You can't, there are no, what's the word I'm looking for? It's just, it's here and it's happening. And I suppose the Nakosa, we were talking about the numbers, but we never really appreciated what it would mean. And made worse by the fact that we knew that many of the, or a significant number of the returning ANC exiles were infected. And there was nothing to offer. So it was a horrible situation because, yes, you were pissing on the parade, as you say, because we had HIV. We didn't have the drugs at that stage. I remember basically that we were absolutely hoping that there would be strong leadership from the Department of Health and a recognition that this disease was about sex and therefore it was about gender, and a hope that we would start addressing those issues. And I think that is the failure, to understand the gender dynamics of the epidemic, its links to poverty. And I think also at that stage, for a lot of people, it was a case of collecting the data and looking at it with horror, but not knowing how to convey that information to policymakers. I mean, and we're going to see exactly the same thing. You know, we could be doing this interview in 20 years' time, and then the questions you would be asking me would be around obesity, around hypertension, around diabetes. Because we all know that activities now are going to have long-term consequences. In exactly the same way we were looking at HIV prevalence and saying, this is going to lead to illnesses, this is going to lead to deaths, but how do you convey it to people who can't see it? Another example might be global warming. You know, how can we carry on doing what we're doing? Those of us who know and think about the future are appalled by our lack of response. I think she came in after the election. I think she came in when the 1999 was the election when Mandela stepped down and Mbeki came in, and I think she came into power in 1999. Yes, because in 1998 Thabo Mbeki had called people together in Pretoria, and he had remember the wooden Mbeki with the child, very uncomfortable, sitting there doing an interview. Do you remember that? Anyway, he called us together in Pretoria. We talked about this, and we had this real view that there was new hope. I think we were all a bit patient. We were saying, Mbeki comes to power, and we need to allow him a bit of time to bed down. Same was true for Mantu. Give him a bit of time. Wrongly, I think. But yes, we had high hopes. No, I think it would have been even more negative, because it has also taken time for the racial dimension of the activism to change.
The racial dimension of
yes.
activism. Tell me about that.
Well, if you look at the early years of the epidemic and who the activists were, it was predominantly, Zaki Ahmed is Indian, Mark Haywood is white, I'm white, Mona Cornell in Joburg, who was leading the AIDS consortium, is white. Basically, there were very, very few black intellectuals in the early AIDS epidemic. There were some, but not many. It was dominated by white Indian colored activists, and I think us jumping on them wouldn't have made it any better, and probably could have made it worse. But then I also have to ask myself, what would I have contributed? Because I could tell the figures. I understand the epidemiology, I understand the future, I understood the economics of what we were looking at. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But more than that, I had a pretty good idea of the consequences of the epidemic, the economic, social and political consequences of the epidemic. But what am I going to tell you to do? If I talk to a policymaker, what gender, poverty, all those things, I don't know where my added value would have been in terms of what you need to do to stop it. And I forget South Africa for a minute. I wrote my first study in Swaziland, it was published in 1994, and prevalence was 8%. Today it's 42% in antenatal attenders. We published the socioeconomic impact study in 94. In 2003 we went back and looked at the drivers of the epidemic, which is a harbinger of the brilliant UNAIDS modes of transmission studies. We did it in Swaziland in 2003. In 2005 we did a study looking at the impact. In 2007 I sat with my Swazi colleagues, and I also need to say that every one of those was done with the Swazis. I've never gone in as an imperialist and done a study. I've always worked with Swazis. In 2007 we said, we're not reaching people. People do not understand. At a visceral level, they understand the magnitude of this because they're burying their friends and their colleagues and their families. But in terms of what's going on in this country, people don't get it. So in 2007, we did a seminal piece of work which was called the Swaziland Emergency Study, which basically went and collected all the data we could. We looked at agricultural production, we looked at mortalities, we looked at infant mortality, adult mortality, we looked at industrial output. And what we showed was a very clear deterioration in most of the indicators. Now, I'm not ascribing cause, but I am saying that sitting over this country like a black thundercloud is the AIDS epidemic. So I can't prove that agricultural production's going down because people are dying, but I'm bloody sure it is. I can't prove that the country is less efficient because of the number of people dying or looking after sick people, but I'm absolutely certain that one of the reasons Swaziland is a country on the verge of collapse is because it has an AIDS epidemic of catastrophic proportions. And the emergency study said two things. First of all, if this were a drought or a flood, the Red Cross would have called it an emergency because mortality levels are so high that it's over the tipping point. Why aren't we doing this? Why is the international community not doing that? That was the first thing. And the second thing that emergencies report said, which was really, really important, is somehow we have to be aware of a contradictory concept, which is a long-term emergency. What I remember is that immediately prior to the 2000 AIDS conference, the presidential panel convened in Pretoria. And I was faced, the the mainstream scientists, the people like me, Jerry Cavadia, William Makhoba, sat in this room for 2 days with a group of people who at best were insane and at worst were malevolently insane.
Oh, this was the dissident.
Yes.
Okay. Tell
And
me about those people, the insanity.
well, effectively there were 4 broad groups of dissidents that I could identify. There were those who said that HIV did not exist. There were those that said that HIV did exist, but it was a harmless virus and we were doing the wrong things. There were those that said HIV did exist, it was a harmless, it might have been a harmless virus, but the treatments were so toxic that we should not be doing it, and that we were killing people by putting them on treatment in the first place. And then there was a 4th group of people, a small group of people among the dissidents, who were just incoherent, and I don't know what they thought. So we were faced with a division in the room of half the people there were convened by Mbeki as the dissident panel, who were assumed to have something sensible to say. The other half were people like myself who were absolutely appalled to be even in the room with those people. And it was the most frustrating, miserable experience. And I remember Jerry Cavadia, who was flying down to chair the AIDS conference, saying to one of the dissidents afterwards, "You're fucking wasting my time." And Jerry doesn't swear very often, but on that occasion he was so livid that he let rip at the dissidents. I walked out of that thinking, you know, where do these people come from? And the other thing that they had in common was that they mostly came from west coasts. They were from the west coast of Australia and the west coast of America. No, there was no meaningful dialogue. I mean, the most obvious thing that I showed, and then my soon-to-be boss, Professor Makhoba, showed, was slides showing increased mortality among young adult South Africans. And we're saying this, you know, forget the causality, admit there is something happening to our young people. Levels of mortality are so much higher than they were, and they're way much higher than they should be. And here we are, we're 5 years into a democratic, 6 years into a democratic government. How can we look at these and say there's not something going on? And they looked at them and said, you're making up these data. Data which came from Stats South Africa. No, there was no meeting of minds. It was a waste of time. Other than, and I guess, but this went out of fashion 100 years ago, you know, when you used to take your children to the insane asylum to laugh at the lunatics. I mean, if we'd been able to laugh at them, it might have been worth being there, but it was, yes, it was absolutely a waste of time. I don't think you'll find many denialists in South Africa today. So I think that era has gone. I think that may have been what it was about. You're going to be talking to a lot of people, and you're going to be asking a lot of people, no doubt, why did the denialists find fertile ground? Why did Mbeki listen to them? What was going on in the society? And you're going to get a range of answers. But I think the commonality would be that the HIV was so overwhelming that if there was a way of making it go away, people were looking for a quick win, that it was about the African Renaissance and painting this part of the world as being the hotbed of a horrible disease, that it's about sex and sexuality, and we tend not to be that comfortable talking about sex and sexuality. And it's about your own moral standards and personal behaviors. And I think the reality is that people don't want to discuss those. And I certainly think that people love talking about other people's, but they don't want to discuss their own. So there are a whole lot of things going on. And if you want to look at probably the very foresighted book, it's Kathy Campbell's Letting Them Die. And I think there may have been an element of thinking almost in a Stalinist way that we do have a lost generation. we can't afford to treat them because in the late 1990s it was incredibly expensive and we didn't have the resources. Maybe we just need to move on. And you know, as Stalin said, one person is a tragedy, a million is a statistic. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Lysenko is a very good example of science gone crazy. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot we could learn from Stalin. You know, it's yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. Yes. So Durban AIDS Conference, we fly down here, and it was an amazing meeting. It was with and in a way, the excitement and the buzz and the opposition and the strength of feeling may not have happened without Mbeki. So maybe we owe him a small thank you for setting up, being the straw man that we could respond to. But we had the Durban AIDS Conference. It was extremely successful. South Africa showed that those amongst us could take it very seriously, that we had the vibrancy, amazing vibrancy. What then happened was, of course, that the conference went away, and then we faced the dark years of taking people to court, lack of treatment, and then the next half a decade are just devastating. 2004, the first. No, for me, 2004 was actually Bangkok. 2006 was Toronto.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. Tell me about Bangkok.
For me, the defining moment of Bangkok was that I had, the previous year, I have a house here in our circles now, South African circles, where our parents would have had full-time domestic workers and workers in the garden. We have people who come once a week or once every few weeks to do things that otherwise would have been done full-time. I was living in a house up on the ridge in Durban, and the person who'd been working in my garden for the last 12 years was getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And I talked to him and suggested that he might have a test. He came to me for 1 day a week, and that was, he had other employees, and in the end his other employees and I said, okay, you have to go and get tested. There wasn't treatment available in the public sector. Go to McCord's Hospital, which was a mission hospital, get tested. If you go on treatment, we will pay for it. And he went off and he got tested. He was HIV positive. His CD4 cell count was 84. He came to me carrying 2 carrier bags of medications, of drugs, and he said, thank you. I'm going to live. I'm going to bring up my daughter. This is my chance. That was just before the Bangkok conference. In Bangkok, I got a phone call from his brother saying this young man had been taken to hospital after 6 weeks on medication, and he was very seriously ill, and he died of meningitis. It's what we would call immune reconstitution disease now. So for me, going to Bangkok marked the moment when the first close person who was close to me died of AIDS. I think I avoided it.
Did you? Oh.
Yeah. I mean, what was the benefit of going and being there? You see, for me, the defining moment of that meeting was not. I mean, there's various hats we wear. One was as a South African internationally known academic who's appalled by what's going on in my country. But on the other hand, it was the moment when I had a whole cohort of young researchers who had reached the point where they were able to go to the meeting and present, and I was also shepherding them through the processes, which was really, really important for me. I think I'm perhaps in a different place from, say, a doctor in a Rob Ferreira hospital or anywhere like that, who's trying to put patients on treatment, because I'm trying to advance knowledge and I'm trying to build capacity. And I'm also operating not just in South Africa, but internationally. So I was running, by 2000, we were running planning courses for how to plan for HIV/AIDS. Not that we knew the answers, but it was really great fun in England, in South Africa. We'd run the programs in Malaysia, Nepal, India, and the Philippines, and Ukraine. I'd worked in Ukraine. And I guess for me, working in Ukraine after the wall came down and as they went through that period of absolute destitution, I came back from Ukraine to South Africa and thought, thank God, at least there's hope in South Africa, because there wasn't in Ukraine.
Okay. That's an interesting perspective.
Because they were going through their pit. They were going into the pit, whereas we were coming out of it.
Coming out of it.
Yeah, but not the AIDS pit, but certainly the rest of it. I mean, we had a democratic government. We had people who cared. We had gone through our revolution.
Let's talk a bit about President Zuma's leadership on HIV and AIDS. Contradictions.
Of course. Yeah, he screws around. Yeah. But then, how many people don't? He does it in a you know, if you look at leadership and how leadership operates, you've got, on the one hand, you've got the sort of moralistic high ground, and I don't know how one deals with this. And on the other hand, you've got the reality, which is that people, men more than women, will have more partners than women. I think that we need to recognize that long-term, stable relationships are the exception, not the norm. And you may go the European system of sequential monogamy, or you may go, and this is the African problem, is that the concurrency of relationships, and that's why the epidemic, it's one of the reasons why the epidemic is so terribly serious here. So, Zuma, do I want our young people to grow up with his views on gender and sex and sexuality? No. Absolutely not. Do I want our young people to grow up looking at the head of the IMF and saying, this is a role model? I don't think so. That is an interesting one, because there is it's a long story which is coming to a head, and we have to go back into Swazi history. We have to understand that this is a group of people who appear homogenous. They're all Swazi, but they're not actually, because they've got the clan, the Dlamini clan, and the clans that form the royal family, who took over the area that's called Swaziland. There's a second group of Swazis who are the people who were there, people they found there, and that's what the Swazi name for them is. They're the people who were living there, and they got assimilated into the Swazi culture. And then there's a third group of people who've moved into Swaziland, who the Swazis call the people who came after. So whilst we think of Swaziland as a homogeneous unit, there are three distinct groups, and there are many clans within Swaziland, and there are hierarchies in the clans. It's not the same as the caste system, but it does mean that there are inequities in traditional Swazi life. So that's the first thing we need to know, is that we haven't got a homogeneous unit. We've got a unit that appears homogeneous, but there are inequities in that. Then we have to add colonialism. And the colonialism which takes place in the 1870s, 1890s, the division of the land. So now suddenly half the country is owned by white farmers, white concessionaires, white miners, and you've got rural Swazis who've been forced off the land, and increasingly it's unable to support them. If you lived in Mozambique, you'll know some of the people who wrote as academics on the concept of peasantry, and I think of John Saul and others. But effectively you've got a peasantry who are now in a position where they can't sustain themselves, and that means we have the beginnings of migrant labor. And indeed, migrant labor is encouraged by the royal family, because the migrants are encouraged to bring back money, and Swaziland is gradually buying back the land which they gave away. So you've got a rural population with peasants moving to, with males moving to the urban areas, reproduction of labor taking place in the rural areas, subsidized in a capitalist sense by the urban areas and by the remittances coming. So we have families breaking down, and this is something which is going to get worse and worse over time because the constraints of the land are there. And I suspect that we're now entering a point where Swaziland cannot sustain itself in the rural areas, and no longer do they want to, because we have too many handouts from World Food Programme, and that's a real issue that we're beginning to see happening there. Then we have the growth of capitalism in Swaziland, and that's an exploitative capitalism, which is, again, in terms of the political economy of Swaziland, it's a core periphery relationship. You've got Swaziland on the periphery of South Africa. You've got South Africa as the core, but in global capital terms, South Africa is on the periphery of the global productive core. Then we've got the questions around gender, which are reinforced by a king who is very wise in guiding Swaziland through the colonial period to independence, but has no concept of gender issues. And if you ever want to read excellent writing on the anthropology of Swaziland, Hilda Cooper is the anthropologist who's done the most important work. So we have the growth of capitalism, we have the major modes of production being sugar, forestry and mineral extraction. You've got very little primary industry. They're all highly they're all capitalism. So you've got the growth of a proletariat, and rural proletariat and urban proletariat. And then we've got what Max Weber called the growth of the bureaucratic bourgeoisie. The people who are running the country, who are taking their wealth from the country, and the royal kleptocracy who are over-exploiting the society. So you've got a society where you've got huge inequality, where you've got a veneer of unitedness but not really, where you've got gender issues which are exceptionally complicated and do nothing for women. You know, they couldn't open bank accounts. You've got males who have a sense of entitlement but no power because they're marginalized as peasants. You've got a state bureaucracy and a royal kleptocracy who are exploiting the society. Into that you bring a virus that is sexually transmitted and it takes off, and then you've got migrancy. And then you've got some real questions about beliefs and belief structures, because in the Swazi culture there were certain things that you would not do. The missionaries come in and Christianity confuses that. So if you take an old traditional practice in Zulu and Swazi culture, it was that you as a young man could never have penetrative sex with a woman, but you could have thigh sex. Suddenly that becomes immoral. And so you've got all these complexities going on in the country. I mean, obviously, transactional sex becomes a survival strategy. It becomes a strategy for women to actually keep themselves going, but it becomes a demand on them from men. You know, how can you turn me down? You lived in Mozambique. I guess you crossed the border. I mean, what appalls me is the way men will hit on women, just routinely. And as an economist, yes, exactly. So I think that there are all sorts of complexities in the society which we have to unpack. And I don't know quite how we do unpack all this. I do think that Swaziland is going to come up with one really revolutionary event in the next year which may transform the society, and that is their idea of a festival of a month of zero infections. And it's based on a very simple idea, and which I'm going to draw for you. If you pass me a piece of paper, and I know this isn't going to work that well. What we know is that if you look at this in epidemiological terms, incidence has done this. and it's trogging along like that. Okay, so our key task is to bring incidence down, bringing down new infections. We shouldn't really worry about prevalence, because if we get people on treatment, then prevalence should rise. What we also know is that, and this is all coming up very recently, is that if we look at viral load, it does that, and then it does that, and then it starts going up. And when you're at this point in viral load, you might have TB, you might have influenza, and your viral load will peak and you're infected. But in order for someone to be infectious, they have to have a significant viral load in their semen or vaginal fluids for infection to take place. It's as the CD4 cell goes down, and this is this big excitement about 96% decrease in infection if you have people on treatment. We're talking about people here. We're not talking about people here. We're talking about people we've found and we've got them on treatment, because your viral load goes down again and stays down. So 20 to 45% of infections are taking place when Joe has got infected and he's gone and slept with Tandi and Mary and Sibongile. So what we need to do is we need to break the cycle of infection. So the best way to do that is to ensure that we have, because this is 4 to 8 weeks, the best way to do that is to ensure that we do not have people who are acutely infected, to reduce across the population the number of acute infections we have. So the best way to do that is to have everyone spend 1 month, everyone, either having safe sex or no sex. And then your incidence does that. And it'll start climbing again, but very much more slowly, because you no longer have this pool of people who are acutely infected. Yeah. They are going to say, and why can it happen? It can happen because the Swazis recognize what's happening to them, and they need a solution. And they need a solution which isn't going to require them doing something forever. They need, you see, the problem with our HIV messaging is we say, be faithful, stick to one partner, and if you fail on that, then you feel you failed completely. This is a small ask. We're saying to the nation, for 1 month, condoms or
Oh my
please.
gosh, it's like Alcoholics Anonymous or smoke enders, 1 day at a time.
But just for 1 month. Yeah, exactly,
Yes,
exactly.
I see what you mean, actually, yeah.
So it's a small ask, and it's a hopeful ask.
Who came up with that?
I did.
Okay,
And I can show you where it was published as well.
fantastic, yeah.
And because I mean, and I was doing I presented. I mean, it's published. It's the idea of a just asking for something which is achievable. And if it works this year, we can do it next year, because it's only a month. It's like Lent. It's like Ramadan. So I think that there is real hope in Swaziland, because they're coming up with some really interesting ideas. Now, how do you do it? They're coming up with ideas like cell phone messaging, like every forecourt garage in the country has that, like doing a pack of condoms and giving it to the guys and saying, it's a month of safe sex. We're giving you 35 condoms. See if you can use them. Or some ridiculous number, like, I don't know. I don't know what it'll be. But it's about coming together as a nation. Now, can it work? My view was that it could only work in small countries like Swaziland, Lesotho, or small populations like Botswana. I think it can work more broadly if you get the buy-in, and the reason I think that is because of what we saw this time a year ago, where this country came together around the World Cup.
Yeah.
And for 1 month, we behaved in a way which we would never have believed was possible. So the Swazi paper which they have developed is called A Festival of a Month of Zero New Infections. And another way of looking at it, which I think, these diagrams are ones that I developed a while ago, but there's another way of looking at it, and that's imagining that in our society, across the nation, we have a big swimming pool which represents all the virus in the nation. If we could stop acute infections, we'd actually drop the level of virus our national stock of virus, so to speak. Because these are the people who are adding the most, disproportionately more to that pool of virus.
Sort of gross viral burden of
Yes,
the
exactly.
population.
Yes, yes. So that's where we are. I think we're I mean, you've asked me about the history. What we need to reflect on is the ways forward, and then we come back to what I think the phrase you use, which is building social capital around this epidemic, because that's what it's going to take to stop it. Well, first of all, it's going to be 5 million people, not 500,000. Secondly, well, what I would do is I would suggest that they go and read a paper that I wrote with Alex Duval called AIDS, a Darwinian Event, ? Because we said that when you look at the levels of mortality that we're seeing in these societies, we asked ourselves, is this Darwinian? Is this so dramatic that it will change society? And again, we're into the counterfactual problem. We won't know. And then I went and talked to my friends in Ireland, and I said, guys, you had a potato famine here in the 1870s, 1880s, and you lost a third of your population. What did it mean? Can you help us think through what it means to lose populations? And my Irish friends have let me down totally. They didn't engage with it at all. Well, we need to learn from Rwanda, we need to learn from Cambodia. Where have there been these events? And I think the one thing that I have learnt, which and I think I need to recognize this, is when I started working in HIV/AIDS, I was there was a book written in 1990, published by a guy called Keith Edelston, self-published, called AIDS, Countdown to Doomsday. And one of the reasons I started responding to this epidemic, because this guy was completely over the top. He was just bizarre. But on the other hand, societies carry on. I mean, I've been predicting Swaziland's collapse for 10 years now. It hasn't. People are resilient. So I think there are lessons from Rwanda and places like that, but I don't know what they are.